Today we'll be starting a new chapter, Class 11 Political Science, Indian Constitution at Work, Chapter 3, Elections and Representation. This video is part 1 of the series. The chapter begins with two questions. 1. Can a democracy function without elections? And 2. Are elections the only provision for democracy? To answer the first question, no, a democracy cannot function without elections. Democracy is a form of government in which people are directly or indirectly involved in the decision-making of a state. Any politically organized state requires some form of collective decision-making, and in a democracy, this decision-making power is vested in the people. And here it says they are directly or indirectly involved. This is why democracy can take two forms. One is an indirect democracy, or representative democracy, and 2 is a direct democracy. In a direct democracy, people vote on the laws and the rules that govern them directly. So for every provision or new law, the collective society votes on it, and if a majority vote yes, the law is enacted. If majority vote no, the law is repealed or vetoed. This is contrasted with a representative democracy, where people elect representatives, and those representatives collectively create, amend, preserve, and approve the laws and rules. In both of these cases, the ultimate source of the power is the people, but the way the power is being exercised is slightly different. This is J.W. Garner's opinion on the different forms of democracy. So direct democracy is seen in Switzerland today, and it was also a characteristic feature of ancient Greek city-states, more specifically Athens. And representative democracies are followed by most modern democracies today, including India, the UK, and the US. Direct democracy is ideal for smaller populations, as it is more efficient and seamless to vote on any new laws. And representative democracies is definitely not suitable for larger, diverse populations, because how can a country with a population like India with 1.3 billion people, how can all of these people vote on new laws and regulations? It's not suitable. Also, it always mutes or suppresses diversity, because in this form of indirect democracy, everyone has to vote on any new provision or law, and it's only enacted if 51% approve, or majority. But what about the 49% of people that reject this proposal? Their vote should be wasted. So that's why in representative democracy it allows for diverse populations and minorities to also preserve their rights. Whereas in a direct democracy, minorities are often suppressed, because the will of the state is always the will of the majority, regardless of how much of a democracy it is. That's why this model is relatively ancient. It's limited to small and less diverse populations, and it's not much prevalent today, only seen in Switzerland. So, in both of these forms of democracy, there's one commonality, which is elections. In direct democracy, people hold an election for every single law, rule, or proposal. And in representative democracy, people vote once every 5 years, depending on the tenure of the representatives. They still have an election to vote for the representatives. So, in conclusion, a democracy cannot function without elections. That answers our first question. Now, second question. It says, are elections the only provision required for a democracy? The answer to this is no. Just because a country or a state holds elections does not demarcate the state as a democracy, does not indicate a democratic government whatsoever, because there can always be malpractices or certain provisions lacking in an election. So there's a separate aspect called democratic elections. Here, the elections have to be free and fair, meaning that there's no malpractice, there's no rigging, there's no miscounting, and there's no bias during the election towards any party. Every candidate, every political party has equal chance of winning. Also, there must be the provision of universal adult franchise, meaning that everyone over the age of 18 has the right to vote, and one person, one vote, one value, meaning that every individual gets only one vote, regardless of their caste, gender, place of birth, nationality. The nationality has to be Indian in an Indian election. Their nationality has to be an American in the USA elections. So the provisions such as you can't be discriminated or prohibited from voting on the grounds of caste, gender, or religion. Similarly, every vote has one value. So a rich person doesn't have one vote equals 100 votes, whereas a poor person has one vote equals 0.5 votes. It doesn't work like that. One vote is equal to one. That value is clear. Also, there must be a legitimate choice available to all the voters. For example, if there's only one candidate contesting in the elections, there would be no democracy, because in a democracy, people have the right to elect their leaders, and if the leaders aren't performing to their wishes, they can remove those leaders and elect a new set of representatives. But if there's only one person contesting, then this fundamental provision of democracy is violated. So therefore, there must be legitimate choice to all the voters. There must be several candidates contesting. In India, we adopted a multi-party system, so there's nearly 750 parties contesting. This ensures that there's a legitimate choice. But beyond just having candidates, the different parties also have to have different manifestos and different ideologies and different views on what to do for society. The problem in recent contemporary times is that all the political parties and all the candidates have similar views on economic growth and development, addressing social inequalities, and some of these fundamental aspects of society, and the only difference between the parties is their ideology. One party is a right-wing extremist, the other party is a left-wing extremist, the third party is a centrist. There's no difference or diversity in the actual manifesto of the parties. So this is a threat to Indian democracy and Indian democratic elections. Lastly, there must be a protection of fundamental rights. Of course, these fundamental provisions such as liberty, equality, justice, fraternity, right to equality, right to freedom, right to religious freedom, right against exploitation, right to constitutional remedies, all of these rights must be preserved, protected, and promoted by every candidate contesting in the elections. Another fundamental provision of a democratic election is that no individual can be prohibited from contesting in the elections as long as he or she is above the age of 25. So there's no caste restriction, religious restriction, or gender restriction on contesting in elections. This is an extension of legitimate choice to all voters. So these provisions are essential for a democratic election, and unless an election constitutes all of these provisions, there can be no indication of a democracy. Many non-democratic rulers are keen on propagating the fact that their state is a democratic rule, such as Saudi Arabia, Mexico. All of these countries are not democratic, although they hold elections, because in Saudi Arabia, women don't have the right to vote, so there's no universal adult franchise. In Mexico, there's only one party in rule for the past 80 or nearly 100 years, so there's no legitimate choice to all the voters. So therefore, these countries cannot be considered as democratic just for the fact that they have or they're holding elections. Non-democratic elections could consist of election malpractices, restricted voting rights, one candidate and one choice, and disregarding fundamental rights. Saudi Arabia and Mexico are chief examples of this. So this concludes part 1. We discussed how elections are the soul of democracies and how they're a prerequisite for any democracy, and also how The simple provision of elections does not constitute a democracy. In part 2, we'll be discussing the election system in India in great length. This includes the FPTP or first past the post system, proportional representation system, and understanding why India chose the first past the post system. So that concludes this video, part 1 of chapter 3 in Indian Constitution at Work, election representation. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I hope you had a great learning experience. And until the next one, this is Nisha Tube signing off. Peace.